Hey guys, it's Max. In front of me, I have Panasonic's new S5 camera, and today I'm gonna be doing a video autofocus comparison against the Sony A7 III that we know has excellent video autofocus. Now, Panasonic reached out to me and they said, hey Max, we have a new camera and we have a whole new autofocusing system that was rebuilt for video from the ground up with brand new algorithms. They made a ton of updates, which I'll tell you guys about. And we want you to put it through its paces. They said, we do not want you to be nice. Show us everything. We wanna see how well it does because we have done a ton of updates. And that's exactly what we're gonna do today. We're gonna put it through very tough tests, indoors, outdoors, face tracking, slider, walking, vlogging. We're gonna see if Panasonic's new system is great. Now, it's in this camera here, and it's also gonna be in upcoming cameras as well. We're gonna start out with both of these set up side by side, and I'm gonna do my standard tests that you guys have seen. Vadim is back here for more autofocusing tests. I know it's been a while. Thank you, Vadim, for doing this. I'm using 24-70s. I have the G Master, I have the Lumix, both f2.8 excellent lenses, high quality. We're gonna make sure this is perfectly fair. And to start out, I'm gonna shoot at 60 FPS. Of course, we have 4K on the Lumix, and the Alpha camera doesn't have that, so I'm at 1080p here. Starting off with Vadim popping up here, both of them shift perfectly smoothly, and the S5 is actually a little bit faster. Same thing going to the background. And what's interesting is I'm not getting that really jerky confirmation with the typical contrast systems where it kind of ruins the focus pull. They look nice and smooth. Here the Sony is slightly faster. I'm not seeing any difference as far as tracking Vadim when he's walking backwards. The S5 tracked him perfectly, didn't lose focus, just like the Sony. And then the same thing goes walking forward. A very nice, smooth focus pull that is on him the whole time. Now I'm gonna have him turn around here, and we're gonna see if it shifts to the background. And it doesn't. Perfect. Now let's test out tracking diagonally where the face isn't really seen that well for a little bit to see if it switches to the background or anything weird like that. And it looks like both the Sony and the Panasonic stay locked on him the whole time. And now we'll switch from face tracking to subject recognition, and we have a nice smooth focus pull back and forth, way better than what we got on the GH5. This is a huge improvement. Now Panasonic not only rebuilt the autofocusing system from the ground up with incredible algorithms and much better tracking system, the actual changes are being made much more effectively. So now I'm gonna drop down, also in APS-C, but to 24 frames per second. I'm gonna skip 30, I'll do a few 30 tests later. But when we go to 24, since this is a contrast-based system, there's a lot less frames there. So we're gonna see how it's gonna do. This time around, both cameras are shooting 4K because now at 24, the Sony can shoot 4K. The S5 is still nice and smooth. We have a tiny bit of pulsing. You guys might not even notice it. Watching back on a 6K monitor here, that time was perfectly smooth. And now walking backwards, I see the S5 lost focus there for a little bit. It was just off and then it caught back up. Both are in focus. And this time walking forward, they look pretty much the same. I'm not seeing a difference. And then once again, popping up, but the Sony's actually slower now in 4K than it was in 1080, and the S5 looks to be just as quick, and once again nice and smooth, and it doesn't back focus and then try to catch back up like we've seen in the past. And now let's go ahead and switch to full frame mode, 24 frames per second. And this mode is the toughest for the camera because of the contrast-based system. You have less frames, you have a lot more data. This camera is oversampling a lot more data than 4K, so there's a ton of processing going on, and let's see how they compare. And now we're in full frame, 24 frames per second mode. You guys see the S5 is now slowing down. It's taking longer than the Sony compared to being quicker than before. As far as the transition, it's still fairly smooth, but we're seeing a little bit more of that confirmation autofocusing pulsing that we saw in the past with the GH5. So when we're pulling more than double the data than needed for 4K in the full frame mode, there's a lot more processing that needs to happen. And we're also at 24 frames per second, which means we have less frames to take a look at. And now for the tougher tracking shot. As you guys can see, it's going out of focus right there, especially when he gets close where the Sony stays locked on, and then it takes a little bit to catch back up. Now walking backwards, it was losing focus, then it locked on, and it's doing okay there at the end. And let's do that one more time. The Sony's tracking perfectly as it does. The S5's having a little bit of a trouble, and you guys can see it's out of focus there until it catches up. And we are shooting at 70mm here, full frame f2.8. So it still looks better than what I experienced with the GH5. It definitely is an improvement, but nowhere near as good as the APS-C modes. Now let's see if we could trick it in these sideways walking shots. These are a little bit slower than before. The Sony's spot on perfect, and it looks like the S5, even full frame 24, when we're going a little bit slower, it's staying locked on and I'm not seeing any pulsing. And for our transition shots, doing surprisingly well, about as fast as the Sony, also very smooth. It's not over focusing, it's not back focusing there. Surprisingly, even full frame 24, it's doing well in this scenario. Before we go outside and do a variety of other tests that are probably a little bit more interesting, I want to do a few more. I want to attach these monitors to the cameras. I know that with my Sony, if I'm using one of these, the face tracking autofocus gets shut off because it's a lot of processing to send out the signal and do all that. And in certain cases, the autofocusing system seems like it's a little bit slower. So I'm going to put these on. Wi-Fi is going to be on as well. That also puts another strain on the system, and we'll see how these compare. And as I've seen before, the Sony does slow down when we add these accessories. Just a little bit slower. It's still doing a good focus pull. Just not as responsive, and sometimes it's not as smooth as well, like you guys saw there. Keep in mind, this is with APS-C 60 FPS on the S5, which is doing a fantastic job, and it's not affected by having a monitor or Wi-Fi enabled. For face tracking, the Sony right there is not keeping up. It's on the background, and bam, it caught up right there, where the S5 was perfectly smooth. Keep in mind, this is APS-C at 60 frames per second. Walking back, both of them did an excellent job. And then walking forward again, once again, we see the Sony's just lagging behind because of the extra processing that needs to happen. It doesn't have the advantage of seeing his face. And for this test, the Sony is locked onto the background because it can't track his face or body at this point until he gets closer and it recognizes him. Where the S5, it can track his face, his head, and his torso. And then when you're closer, both of them are doing a good job. And the same thing goes for this test. We're just seeing a little bit of a sluggier job on the Sony with that monitor where the S5 isn't affected. Since we did that test, I want to do one more. This is a personal one for me. With the Sony, the face tracking is excellent, but if somebody else goes into the frame or people are shuffling around, sometimes it can switch to another face, and I can't just tap on the face and quickly lock on to somebody, whereas the Panasonic, in my testing, it is doing an excellent job. You just tap on the face you want, and it tracks them, and it stays there. It doesn't matter how they shuffle around. Let's go ahead and test that out. Here I have Angelica's face selected. I just tapped on it on the S5, and when Vadim stepped in, the Sony switched to him because he's closer, where the S5 is staying locked on her face because I selected it. And now let's test the opposite. Angelica's up front. I have her face selected on the S5. Vadim's going to come up, and she's going to walk backwards. And here I expected the Sony to switch to Vadim, but it didn't yet. It kept tracking her, even though he's closer, until he gets close enough that it decides to switch over. And on the S5, whatever face you tap on, it's going to stay locked on just that face, which is extra convenient, being able to switch it on the fly. Finally, we are outside. This first test that I want to do is to test out how well the subject recognition is on the Panasonic. With my Sony, a lot of times if I have a wider shot and somebody's too far back, it won't see them, and then it'll just focus on the background. And I want to see how these two compare. This one I'll do at 30 FPS. And just like I expected, with the subject being this far back, the Sony can't recognize them, it can't see the face, so it's staying locked on the background, whereas the S5 picked up his body and focused on him. Next, let's try something that might be even more difficult. I'm going to be walking with Vadim, recording him, and that is difficult because the distance between us keeps changing. He walks a little faster, I walk a little bit faster, we're getting closer, further together. I'm also maybe gonna do a little spin. It's gonna be definitely tough. Now, a lot of times I could use a gimbal for this. Of course, both these cameras have IBIS, so it might be a little IBIS test as well. But the gimbal, that smooths everything out. there's not as much jitter and shake. And I think with that shake, it's gonna make it more difficult for the Panasonic because it has to look at the image and analyze it. Let's go ahead and test this out. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice is the differences in IBIS performance. Yes, the IBIS is turned on the Sony. Both are in focus though. The Panasonic is tracking him well. Even though Vadim's walking, I'm walking away from him, getting closer. I am seeing a little bit of pulsing in the background, but it's minimal, and that is on my large 6K display. And now for full frame 24 frames per second, which is the most difficult for the Panasonic S5. And I expected it to just shift to the background or have a ton of pulsing, but it's not. It's working surprisingly well. I walked back even further from Vadim this time. Thankfully, it could track not only his face and head, but also his torso, so it's able to stay locked onto him. And looking at the background, pulsing is kept to a minimum. You might not even be able to see it. And now I want to do something that might be a little bit crazy. I'm gonna just have Vadim just sprint at me, run really fast. All the settings so far have been out of the box. Literally, I haven't touched it exactly how it is out of the box. And Panasonic, they don't want people to have to go in and do a ton of settings and change to try to get usable autofocus. They want it to a great out of the box like my Sony does. So, but for this one, if somebody's running, you want the autofocusing to go faster. So that's what I'm gonna change. At 60 FPS, the Panasonic really surprised me. It stayed locked on his face the whole time, and even at the end, it didn't have to hunt to confirm focus as typical with contrast systems, and even APS-C at 24, it did a really good job. Now, the transition is not as smooth as the Sony, but it is definitely usable for this. Now, if you go to full frame 24, it can't keep up. It lost there right at the end, and then had to catch itself again, and it hunted. And now let's do a vlogging test. Autofocus is super convenient for vlogging. Of course, the new Panasonic has a flip out screen. Most Panasonics do, super convenient. My Sony doesn't have that, but the autofocusing system is reliable. I know as long as I'm pointing at myself, it's gonna get me in the shot. Let's see how this does. I'll start out with the Sony, and as you would expect, it is perfectly fine. We're not shifting to the background, we're not pulsing, it's being locked onto my face with that face detection. And for the Panasonic, I'm gonna go straight away to the toughest mode, full frame 24 frames per second, because we want that wide angle field of view without a crop, and 30 FPS will be better than this in full frame. And I'm surprised that it's staying locked onto my face, even though there's so much contrast in the background and so much distractions. Pulsing is pretty much unnoticeable. We're not hunting, and it is just staying locked on. So for vlogging, it's doing great. So we are back inside. Thankfully, the sun was scorching me out there. And I have a couple more tests, something that I'm very curious about. I have the camera on the slider. I'm gonna test out the A7 III as well. This is a shot where it gets a little bit difficult, where you're punching in and pulling out on a slider. Side to side is easy. This is where my Sony sometimes, especially when I'm pulling back, can get off a little bit. And this is full frame 24. The most difficult autofocusing, setup for the S5, and I was surprised that it is keeping up. Now I am going smoothly and slowly on the slider, but it has to keep adjusting the autofocus, and it has to do it smoothly, which it is doing a great job, and you can actually do an even better job in any of the other modes. And now finally, I want to do a touch to focus. I want to see the contrast system. Is it going to be smooth? Or is it gonna, mess up a little bit or have a lot of pulsing in it like, the previous GH5 had, at least the last time that I used it. My Sony is excellent at this. Here's an example of the Sony. We're getting nice, smooth, consistent focus pulls without any focus hunting for confirmation. So this is exactly what we want. And for the S5, let's start out with the toughest test here. This is full frame 24. As you guys can see, it is not as smooth and the speed isn't as consistent. And now 4K 24, but in APS-C. As you guys can see, that is way faster, way smoother. We're getting a little bit of pulsing, but it's much less than before. And finally, 4K 60, you guys could see it's even smoother, more responsive, less pulsing. Sometimes we have a little bit of focus confirmation, but very minimal. Now I'm tapping much quicker now. Pretty much as soon as it focuses on, I'm tapping because of how responsive it is. And this is really the best mode if you want to have the best autofocus. So there you guys have it. We just did a ton of different tests with the Panasonic and the Sony. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Overall, I was impressed. Panasonic is still using a contrast-based system, but there have been so many little updates and huge updates under the hood. All algorithms are brand new, the tracking systems are new, and let me just say they have done an incredible job. In 4K 60, it does awesome. Even I was shocked. Even for the running shots, I did not expect that. The tap to focus is way better than what they had before. Walking shots, I mean, it definitely is usable. If you're gonna throw it on a gimbal, you're gonna be vlogging, you can now trust the system. The one area, and I knew this coming into it, in full frame 24, some cases like vlogging, it still did great. So that's where it has the toughest time. There's, the sensor is large, it has a lot of extra data, it's a lot of things that it needs to read, it's contrast based, so that's where it has a little bit of trouble. I would be a lot more careful and cautious what you're doing. Some things like tapping the focus, tracking things, they'll do a good job. But if you're walking towards the camera, it still has a little bit of issues. But other than that, if you want great autofocus, go into the APS-C mode. And especially for things, I know a lot of people use autofocus for gimbal work. It is really impressive. To be honest, I didn't think it was gonna be that good. So good job, Panasonic engineers. The Sony, obviously this does not have 4K 60. There's a lot of limitations there with the monitor. When you're tracking further objects, it can't pick you up. It can't pick up full bodies or car tracking. It's an older system in here. Still does a good job, but with 4K full frame, it does a great job there, where the Panasonic is still a little bit behind. But if you're wanting a Panasonic or you've owned Panasonic cameras, and the autofocus, you wanted it to be better, here we have it, and this is gonna be in future Panasonic cameras. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you guys are subscribed by clicking that little circle above. This has been Max, and I will see you in the next video.